As you know from prior lessons, there are three different scrolling options that we can choose from in Pro Tools. If we come up here to the Options menu and down to Edit Window Scrolling, we can choose these different options. So no scrolling, if we have that selected, prohibits Pro Tools from scrolling as your audio plays. So if I'm over here, it's just going to continue to play, but we won't be scrolling. The second option available for you is after playback, which means Pro Tools will scroll only after you've stopped. So in this case, as soon as I hit the space bar again, it stops and then scrolls to the place where the playback cursor is located. The third option is the page option. This is the one I use the most. And basically, when it reaches the right-hand side of your page, it scrolls so that your playback cursor is always in view. Okay, and just as a review, that final option is continuous, and it just keeps the playback cursor in the center of your Pro Tools edit window. So those are your scrolling options. Loop playback is also another feature that's really important, and I use it all the time, especially when I'm editing or when I want to just hear a specific part of my audio over and over again. We can find loop playback under the options menu because it is something we turn on and off. And you'll see right there, loop playback, and it does have a shortcut associated with it, Shift Command L. So I'll go ahead and use that, Shift Command L. And now loop playback is on. You can tell it's on by, if you look at the play button here, you can see that it's looping. If I turn it back off, Shift Command L, it just shows a regular green playback button. So Shift Command L turns playback on and off. What that means is that if you make a selection and press the space bar, Pro Tools will continue to play that particular bar until you hit stop. The only limitation is if you choose something that's less than a half a second, Pro Tools won't loop that particular selection. So if I make something, I think this is less than a half second, yes. And you'll see that Pro Tools won't loop that because it's less than 0.5 seconds. You can also adjust your loop playback selection by moving the in and out locators, which are located right here. So if you're playing and decide, oh, I just want to hear those 2 beats, or maybe these 2 beats, you can grab those markers and move them. So you can drag the in and out points in the timeline ruler to adjust your loop playback. One thing you will notice is if you just make a selection here, and then make another selection here, that doesn't give you the same result. You actually have to move the timeline in and out markers. So that's loop playback. That's some of its functionality, and I think you'll be using loop playback a lot. There are 4 basic edit modes that you can select from in Pro Tools. They're up here in the upper left-hand corner. They are the shuffle mode, spot mode, slip, and grid mode. First of all, there are a number of commands that we can use to get to these modes. We can use our F1 key. So F1 is shuffle, F2 slip, F3 spot, and F4. So those 4 modes you're using constantly as you're editing in Pro Tools. Shuffle mode is a mode that allows us to move our clips around or change the order of our clips without adding spaces between them or having them overlap. So you can use shuffle mode to arrange adjacent clips in your session. So let me give you an example. Here I've got I've got this drum loop playing now. Let me turn it down a little bit so you can hear my voice. Now if I'm in shuffle mode, what I could do is I could grab and move some of these clips around. And as I do, you can see everything remains in the same location. It's just moving them around. So if I delete this one, what it'll do, because it's in shuffle mode, it'll shift all of these clips to the left. So if I hit delete, you can see now it's moved everything to the left. Let me undo that. Also, if I grab this particular clip and I move it over here to the left, now everything will push to the right and make space for that clip. So it's a way for us to change or alter our data here or move our clips around, but keep them all adjacent. Let's see, where do we stick this one up here maybe? Do something unusual. Okay, so this is a mode that is useful if you want to keep all your audio clips right together. So you can see that as I delete each clip, it's going to move all the clips to the right of the deleted clip. It's going to move them to the left to make up the space or close that gap. Slip mode allows you to maneuver your audio clips around without being constrained either to a grid or without moving other clips to close in the gap like you would in the shuffle mode. In slip mode, you can get there by hitting F2, and then you can see as I delete a particular file, instead of it moving everything to the left to close that gap, it leaves the gap there. Also, you'll notice that you can move an audio clip freely without it being constrained to the grid. You can access the spot mode by clicking on F3, and the spot mode allows you to place an individual clip at a certain location. So if I'm in spot mode and then I click on this particular clip, it brings up the spot dialog box. Here I can tell Pro Tools the exact location that I want that clip to be located at. So if I select beat 2 of bar 2 and click OK, it's going to move that clip to that new location. You can set your timescale to either be bars and beats or minutes and seconds, whatever you want. Okay, so we could set it for, let's say, 3 seconds. And it's going to place that clip right at 3 seconds. So spot mode gives you a way to spot your clips at a specific time location, a certain beat and bar location, or maybe even a time code location. So that is spot mode. In grid mode, you can make edits and move audio clips based on the timing interval that's defined by the grid. If I go to grid mode by hitting F4, you can see the grids right here. And you can see that because I'm in grid mode, I'm snapping to the grid. And our grid value is right here. So right now we are set at eighth notes for the time, or I'm sorry, quarter notes right now. So you can see we are snapping to the grid. So if I try to move any of these clips, they are all going to be constrained by the grid value that I have selected. So that is what grid mode does. It actually constrains your audio clip or your editing that you're working on to a specific grid value. Now there are two types of grid mode. One is absolute and one is relative grid. You can get to those by clicking on the grid button. Each time you click the grid button, it will swap back and forth between relative and absolute grid, or by pressing on F4 multiple times. For each time you hit it, it will go back and forth between relative and absolute grid. So what's the difference between absolute and relative grid mode? Let's say, for example, that you wanted this particular audio file, this audio clip right here, You wanted it to start slightly before the beat. But what you wanted to do was move it one beat later, so a whole quarter note later. Well, if you're in grid mode and you do this and you click on that audio clip and try to move it, it's going to constrain it to the grid. That's not what you want. You don't want it right on the grid. You want to move it by the grid value, so you want to move it one beat later or one quarter note later, but you still want it to start earlier than the beat. In that case, you would use relative grid mode, because what do you want to have happen is you want that audio clip to maintain its relative position to the grid. So here you can see we've moved that now by a quarter note, but we've moved it relative to the grid. So it still has this distance from here to here. It's still maintaining that distance, whether it's located here or down here or up here. As soon as we go to absolute grid mode, it will make that audio clip lock exactly to the grid. So that's the difference between absolute and relative grid mode. You can also bypass the grid mode briefly by holding down the Command key on a Mac. If you hold down the Command key, essentially you're allowing Pro Tools to operate briefly in slip mode. So if I hold Command key down and then grab my clip, you can see that I can move it like I'm in slip mode. So grid mode, hold down the Command key, grab the clip. Now it's in slip mode and I can adjust it. And then I could go back to relative grid mode and move that particular audio clip based on its relative position to the grid. There's one last edit mode that I wanted to discuss with you, and it's called the snap to grid mode. You can access the snap to grid mode by selecting the grid mode and then shift clicking on any of the optional edit modes that are available. So I could do a shuffle to grid, or I could also do a slip to grid or a spot to grid. Okay, and I'm just doing that by holding down the shift key. You can also get to that individual mode by pressing down the F2 and F4 key if you want slip to grid, or F1 and F4 if you want shuffle to grid, or F3 and F4 if you want spot to grid. That's how you enable the snap to grid mode. What this mode does is that it allows you to make individual edit selections based on the grid mode, but your actual editing is done in the other mode. So in this case, I have slip to grid selected. So if I make an edit here like that and then choose to cut that audio, now when I zoom in and I move the audio like this, it's acting as though it's in slip mode. So your edits act as though they're in slip mode, but your initial selection acts as though it's in grid mode. You could do the same thing with a shuffle mode. So shuffle to grid mode, and we could make our selection here, and that's using the grid mode, and then we could cut it, and if we delete that audio now, you'll see everything shuffles back to the left to fill that space. So here I make my grid selection, delete, and it shuffles back to the left.